Hello everyone, my name is James. Welcome to Kings Fine Woodworking. Today we're going to build a memorial cross. This is a project that was requested of us by one of our community members. We have a closed community group on Facebook, and it's really just a page where woodworkers help other woodworkers. We share advice, get project ideas, you can share pictures of your work, and it's really become a community, almost a second family. And whenever we get a request from someone in there, we usually make every effort to honor that. We did get the blessing of this community member to make a video from this project, and hopefully it will serve as a reference to help some of you if you need something like this. This project was made with pink ivory wood, which is an exceedingly rare wood, and purpleheart. We thought this would make a beautiful combination. As you can see, both species came in rough, and so the first thing we'll need to do is to mill them down to size before we can begin. Purpleheart is an amazing wood. It comes from any one of 23 different species of trees, all within the Peltogyna genus. These are giant flowering trees that can actually reach about 160 feet tall. They are found throughout Central and South America, with the majority of the trees being found in the Amazon basin. But the most amazing thing of all is its unique organic chemistry that, due to a series of oxidation reactions, will turn it bright royal purple. Which of course is how it gets its name, and almost every woodworker has either seen or heard of purpleheart. Once we had the block milled to size, I took it over to the CNC machine, and I decided I would go ahead and cut this out on the CNC. It was a quick and easy project to do it this way, and I get perfect results. We of course could have cut a cross like this out with a jigsaw, but purpleheart, with the hardness that it has, would make it a really difficult task. I thought this would just be the easiest way to go. We decided not to cut it all the way through, and rather to go ahead and trim it with the bandsaw. Sometimes when you're cutting all the way through real high density woods like purpleheart, we end up breaking the bit and damaging the piece. This way it's easier to just cut it about 70 to 80% of the way through, and then trim the outside edge with the bandsaw, and then we can just flush trim that little bit of excess off. You can see once we've milled down through a portion of this purpleheart how it's not as vibrant or as purple on the inside, and typically in the center of the tree it's not really very purple. The wood that's in there has yet to oxidize, so if we let this sit out in the air or in the presence of UV light, which is much faster, it'll oxidize and become deep purple. This is one of the things that I write about in our Facebook community group. I have an article on how to make purpleheart very purple and how to keep it purple for a lifetime. If something you might be interested in, you might consider joining our Facebook group. I'll put a link to that in the description below. And there's a lot of useful articles in there, and this is a beautiful wood, so I would hate to see this thing change color. So once we have the perimeter of that cut out, we have that little lip that I did not cut with the bandsaw. So I'm going to take this flush trim bit and trim the rest of it off. Now this is a special flush trim bit that's all solid carbide, and it has a bearing above and below, so I can use the bearing in either location depending on what I'm looking for. In this case, of course, I'm using the bearing down below, and this allows me to plow through a lot of wood at once because it's a pretty big, aggressive bit. But even so, purpleheart is so hard and so dense that I'm just taking it slow, and I'm just cutting a little bit at a time, especially when I go around the corners. I'm not pulling the bearing all the way back to the surface of the wood on the first pass. I'm just easing into it, and that kind of helps me prevent tear out and prevent burns. I've gotten this far on the project, so I'd like to see it completed without any damage to it. And if you looked closely at that bit, you would see that it is a spiral cutting bit, and this is actually an up and down spiral, so it goes in, the curves go in both directions at the same time, and that kind of gives you the cleanest possible cut on any wood that you're trying to cut with it. I'm going to take up just a minute at this stage and go ahead and sand some of that roughness off and get the jagged stuff from the corners off of the piece before I continue. And going around the sides of the cross in order to get rid of some of those burn marks or any potential unevenness, I'm just going to do that by hand. and it'll follow the contours a little bit better. And you can always wrap a piece of sandpaper around a dowel or any cylindrical object that you have that's roughly the same radius as what you're trying to sand. In this case, I ended up needing to mount it in my vise to get a good grip on it, and that'll help eliminate any burn marks or anything that goes on in those corners. After that, I wanted to go to a very small roundover. Turns out the only roundover bit that I had that was this size was pretty old, and it's pretty dull. I did not have time to get to a store to get a new one, so as you can see, as I'm cutting this here, I have a few burns. So I did take the time to sand off every burn. I think if you're going to make a project that's really made to last a lifetime, that you should put in every effort to sand off any burns or any unevenness so that you have a perfect project. And now it's time to mill up the pink ivory. My daughter, Maya, is going to do that for me, and she's just trying to find the flattest piece or the flattest edge on this piece of wood in order to surface it. It's a pretty precious wood, so we'll do whatever we can to conserve it as we're going here. And you can see that's a really beautiful wood. It has a lot of unique characteristics. It's extraordinarily hard. Once she has one edge milled flat, then she'll put that flat edge against the fence in order to get a second side done, and those two sides are now square, 90 degrees to one another, which is what's important. And once she has the two of those square, she can move over to the table saw and she can cut the other two faces that have not yet been cut to become parallel with the first two, and then we will have a perfectly square piece of stock to do our next work on. Pink ivory was the royal wood of the Zulu people in Africa, and it used to be that only members of the royal family could even possess it. And if a non-royal were in possession of it, the penalty was in fact death. It is exceedingly rare and grows in only one place on Earth, and even in the location where it is found, only one tree out of every 100,000 in that forest is actually a pink ivory tree. Fortunately, the government of Zimbabwe these days has protected the tree, and they are actively making an attempt to keep this a sustainable, harvestable product. And it's available for very limited permits. So if you search real hard online and you're willing to pay the price, you can obtain some pink ivory wood for yourself. And now you can see here we are engraving the cross with a Bible verse that was requested. Once that's done successfully, I'll take this over to the table saw and we will slice off the piece of this that we are going to use. If for any reason there was an error, then I could have taken it over to the jointer and I could have just taken off the minimum amount to get back to fresh wood again and tried again. We were doing everything we could to conserve the wood and not have any waste, even in the event of an error. Whenever you're cutting really thin strips like this, it's important to have a good tool like the gripper is what I'm using here. We're not sponsored by the gripper or anything like that, but it's a very safe tool to grab hold of the wood, especially thin pieces, and make sure that they are held down firmly when you pass them between the table saw blade and fence. And here we're engraving the second portion of the cross. This is the top portion. The first engraving that we did was the bottom, this is the top, and then we'll do the horizontal piece last. We'll follow the same procedure, and once we have a successful engraving, we'll take it over to the table saw and slice off the portion that we need. I just wanted to mention that if you like our videos, it would really help us out if you would hit that subscribe button down below. And if you click the bell, then you'll get notified of new things each time they come out. And you can see we're back at the CNC machine. I have changed out the cutter for something a little bit bigger, and we are cutting the final portion of the cross, the horizontal portion of the cross out. And of course we will do the same thing one final time and slice off the portion that we need with the table saw. For this horizontal portion of the cross itself, I've decided to make it a little bit thicker to make it stand out a little taller than the vertical members. And I think that's going to give some nice three-dimensional appeal to the overall design. And the next step is for me to cut these pieces to their exact and final width, and I'm doing that at the chop saw. We have measured and made little marks so that the wording is actually centered within each piece. So the next step is I want to put a very small bevel on the edges of these pieces. I have a pretty big base on this router, and I am just barely cutting a chamfer off, probably a 1/16 of an inch or maybe a little bit less. So I thought I would just clamp this in my vise and do it here. A little bit easier than turning the router right side up and doing it. And whenever I route these things, these chamfers, it's always important to route the end grain first, because you may get a little bit of tear out along the end of it at the end of your pass. And then if you follow that up by routing the long grain second, then you'll actually eliminate that tear out that you had in the first place. So route the end grain first, and then route the straight grain second. So at this point I will take a moment and do the final sanding on most of the pieces here before I move to assembly. And this is really an enormous amount of surface area, and no fasteners other than glue will be needed at all. And I just left the back side of the vertical portion of the cross here rough. It's going to give us a little bit better glue bond that way. Not that we need it. This would be impossible to pull apart once the glue has cured. I have actually marked and made measurements very faintly on the cross to make sure that I get this aligned absolutely perfectly. But the first thing I need to do once I set this in place is I'm going to have to press it down into place and rub it back and forth just a little bit to ensure that that glue bonds really well, especially because I was only able to glue one side here. I glued the Pink Ivory and I didn't glue the Purpleheart. But if I work it in there a little bit, it's going to get a good secure bond. After that, I took my time and carefully clamped it into place. And while the clamps are holding the first piece in and it's drying, I can move on to the second piece and put that in place. And I'll just use the same technique here. I'll kind of squish it around into place nicely, and then I'll take my time and clamp that up as well. And of course, while that's drying, I can move on to the third and final piece. One tip for clamping really slippery things together like this is to just use a bunch of clamps and put very low pressure to start. If you put low pressure, you can still move the piece around to fine-tune its position, and just gradually add clamps and gradually add pressure once it is seated in place firmly. After letting that cure overnight, I remove the clamps and we're going to do a final sand of the entire piece. With the sanding complete, I'm going to move on to a semi-gloss lacquer. And it's going to take quite a few coats of lacquer. I'm just going to show a little bit of it here. I think we ended up putting about 8 coats total. And it's important to put very thin coats. You don't have to hit absolutely every square inch of surface area. If it's a little faint or a little light in some areas, that's fine. As you add coats, your finish will develop and it'll end up looking really good. And I did set the Purpleheart wood in the sun for a day through a window so that it would turn bright purple before I proceeded to put the finish on. And here's the piece just after the last coat. The coat does have to dry, and then I scuffed it lightly with 2000 grit sandpaper to give it a little bit more of a matte finish when it was all done. And there it is upon completion. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching.